I'm going to carry on now talking a little bit more about making sense of some of the recorded crime data. I can speak from very recent experience about having put in a request with CSE. They were very, very accommodating. We put in one of those specific defined space requests. We're doing some work with CCPU around a feasibility study for evaluating CCTV, or multiple CCTV projects, and they were incredibly accommodating, helpful, and provided a lot of guidance around what they could and couldn't provide. So please absolutely do get in contact with them. In terms of trying to make sense of some of the data they might provide, so imagine you've put in a request for that information and you've received the data back, or you're still developing your request for information. I just want to talk about a couple of things to think about. The first thing to think about in terms of recorded crime data is making sense of longer term trends in the data. So Fiona mentioned about looking over a period of time, and that's really important. You want to know whether you're dealing with an acute or a chronic hotspot. Is it a hotspot right now but hasn't been a hotspot until recently? Or is the place that you're targeting a genuine long-term hotspot for crime? Has high levels of crime existed there for a period of time? And both sorts of hotspots actually exist. We've done some research in other jurisdictions and we can demonstrate that certain places are hotspots for a period of time, and that's because of a very particular reason. There's something about that's changed there, the activity that's going on there that's caused crime to spike for a particular period. Other places are just genuinely high crime areas, and that is for different reasons. It's important to distinguish between acute and chronic hotspots. The other point to make, and the Hague Park example that I'll come back to is a really good example of this, is it a critical incident that you've dealt with? Is there a critical incident that's occurred at that place that's raised people's concern about safety? Or is it a trending crime? Is there a kind of genuine crime problem, ongoing crime problem, or is it a particular incident that's led to as I said, led to concerns about safety? Be really specific. Obviously, you've got that resource and the ability to do that, but be specific about particular crime types, locations and times and days of week. Being specific about crime types is really important because different crimes have obviously very different causes and will require different interventions. So it's really important that you do think about the different sorts of offences that might be occurring or that you think might be occurring. Look for areas of concentration, and so that's the point about trying to drill down as far as you possibly can in terms of understanding where crime's occurring, because even in small spaces there'll be a micro space where crime is particularly concentrated, and where you can get access to that information, that can be really useful from a prevention point of view. And finally, try and compare the location you're focused on with the areas surrounding, but also other similar locations. So how does your area actually compare to, if you're targeting a particular park, how does that compare to other parks in your local council? And how does it compare to crime generally? Because this can, again, help to understand whether it's a particular concentration of crime within that hotspot, whether there's something unique about that particular place, and not suggesting that necessarily having equal levels of crime as elsewhere is okay or normal, but certainly it can be helpful in terms of understanding whether there's particular risk factors at that particular place that you're trying to target. So some of you will be familiar with this in terms of understanding crime problems, but it's a fantastically simple idea of the problem analysis triangle, and the idea that really crime occurs because of three things: an offender, a motivated offender, a suitable target, suitable victim, and usually the lack of capable guardianship, but something about a place that makes it suitable for crime. The idea here is really, really simple, is that if you can take away one of those things, you can stop crime from occurring. That's the idea. It's that simple. And time again, there's some fantastic examples that show this works. You don't need to target everything, is the point. You don't need to think, okay, well, who are the offenders that are targeting this particular place? We need to do something to try and stop those particular people targeting it. But we also need to change something about the place, because if we don't change something about the place as well, then the crime will continue to occur. Oh, but what about our target? No, pick one and target it. Design your intervention around a particular intervention point, and that can work. So why target places? Why do we have a grant program that's about infrastructure targeting particular places? Well, first point's really important, which is that a few places contain a really large proportion of crime. If people try and argue differently, they're wrong. Flat out, they're wrong. There are particular hotspots for crime, and that's consistent in Australia, overseas, in Victoria, in New South Wales. It doesn't matter. There's really, really good evidence that a lot of crime occurs in a very small number of places. It's not evenly distributed. True for nearly all crime types. And that's really important from an intervention perspective. We did some analysis in the Northern Territory actually, and we were able to demonstrate that the top 5 hotspots in police divisions were responsible for 25% of violent crime in those police divisions. Things like hospitals, police stations, licensed premises, public housing areas, some of the town camps. You know, these very specific places were responsible for a really large proportion of violence. We know, and I'm going to keep harping on about this, but targeting places is a really effective crime prevention strategy. And again, there's really good evidence of this. And the smaller the area that you can target, the more effective you can be in terms of reducing crime. The naysayers will tell you that crime will simply move elsewhere. Again, the evidence says that this really isn't a natural outcome of a place-based strategy. It can occur, but the evidence is overwhelmingly that it's more likely that you'll get a diffusion of benefit to surrounding areas. Displacement is not as common as people might like to make out, particularly with these sorts of projects. And that's a really important point to take away. And that's what I was saying about in terms of diffusion of benefit. Reducing crime in one particular high crime place can reduce crime in surrounding areas. So thinking a little bit more deeply, why do particular places become crime hotspots? One of the ways to think about it kind of draws on some of the crime pattern theory and some of the environmental criminology, and it talks about crime generators, crime attractors, and crime enablers. It sounds, awfully kind of, unnecessarily complex, but it's a really nice way of thinking about what's driving crime at places. So crime generators, they're places that attract large numbers of people. There's crime because there's lots of people. Shopping areas are case in point, public transport, major events. The crime occurs there because there's lots of people coming together in that place. Crime attractors are those places that attract people who are motivated to commit crime because there's some sort of opportunity. They know there's an opportunity to commit crime at that place, to engage in sort of antisocial or criminal behaviour. So there's something that's attracting them there. Entertainment, particularly problematic entertainment precincts can be that. So whether there's a known kind of drug market or opportunity to use drugs and engage in drug-related crime, for example, in an entertainment precinct, that can make it a crime attractor. And finally, crime enabler is something when there's a little regulation of space, particularly around surveillance, so be it formal surveillance, so we're talking about CCTV, but also informal and natural surveillance. So that's a crime enabler. The point is that a place can be any one of these things. And what you're looking for is the things that make a particular place a crime attractor, crime generator, or crime enabler. And let me give you an example. We've done some analysis of crime at train stations in another jurisdiction, and we were looking about, well, what about particular stations made them a crime generator? What made them attract crime? So when we're talking about a crime generator, not surprisingly, those stations that had a lot more patronage had more crime. Makes sense, right? More people, more crime. What was also really important was those places that were interchanges also had more crime, and that was because you had lots of people converging in a place and also people who were waiting to move between trains. So that was something about those stations that was a crime-generating characteristic. Crime attractors, well, when we were looking at particular stations that had late-night accessibility, people were able to move in and out of the train station at night. That made it a crime attractor because people were able to commit crime at that location without surveillance. And related to that point, what was making those stations crime enablers was the lack of surveillance in particular areas, not stations as a whole, but particular areas within those stations. So it's a way of unpacking your problems to think a little bit more deeply about what's actually causing your public area to become a crime hotspot. Similarly, in terms of thinking about concentration of crime can be concentrated for a number of reasons. It can be because of repeat offenders, the same people coming back and targeting a particular location. And that suggests something about either who that place attracts or their motivations. Probably not something that necessarily you might target for this particular type of project, but certainly something to think about in terms of why a hotspot's a crime attractor. Why this crime is concentrated. Related to that, there may be repeat victims. Victims might be people, they might be things. There might be something about that place or people or things in that place that are repeatedly target. And that's something you can intervene to reduce in terms of public safety infrastructure. Hotspots are places that are particularly prone to crime, and it's something about the place that makes that place prone to crime occurring there. Crime could be concentrated because of hot products, things that people want to steal. So if there's a theft problem, it might be something that people want to actually take from that location. Hot products can also include targets for graffiti. So it might be something particularly within that public space that's particularly prone to graffiti, and that makes it a hot product, and that's what you're actually targeting then. And finally, there's this idea of risky facilities, and that's this idea that you can have lots of places that are the same, but the crime is unevenly distributed. So Fiona and George talked about parks, for example. So you might have particular parks in your local council, and one of those is a particularly risky facility because it's got a disproportionate amount of crime occurring there. So different ways of thinking about why crime is concentrated in a public space or private space even, and what that means in terms of intervention. Okay, that's a very brief overview of problem solving in terms of understanding crime problems. There are some fantastic guides available to you, freely available. I'll present some here, but I'll make the links available in the online version of the presentation. One of these fantastic guides, and we draw on a lot in terms of understanding problems, and I'm a really strong advocate for, is this crime analysis for problem solvers. It's been around for 10 years, longer than 10 years. Very policing focused, but it's a really useful resource in terms of understanding particularly public's crime problems. There's a new one, problem solving for neighbourhood policing. It's kind of a more simple version of the first one, but again, another really useful resource to draw upon in terms of understanding crime problems. And finally, I have to give a plug. We produced a resource around tackling property damage based on some systematic review that we did a few years ago. And that really talks about the questions that I've sort of been discussing around what questions you need to answer in terms of understanding your crime problem, but actually walks you right through to choosing an intervention, implementing it and evaluating it. So it kind of covers the whole gamut, but there's some really useful resources. And these things are where I'd really encourage you to read and try and really think about your problems in a bit more detail. So as I said, I'll make the links available to those in the online version. Okay. The other point I want to make here is that not all crime problems and safety problems are crime problems, right? So a lot of the crime problems that you'll deal with in particular public places aren't actually about crime occurring at all. They're about perceived crime or fear of crime in the community. And what's really important, if you take nothing away when I start talking about fear of crime, it's kind of something I've been talking a bit about lately, is the idea that reducing crime will not naturally lead to a reduction in fear of crime. The same two things can't necessarily be targeted by the same strategy. One will not affect the other, and it works both ways. So you might bring crime down, but you may have no impact on people's perceptions of safety. It requires a particular response, and it requires a particular understanding of what's going on. So it's a really important point, and a distinction I want to make. Now, it's a really fancy slide to show you how complicated fear of crime is. We know from decades of research that there's lots of things that influence fear of crime in a community and perceptions of safety. And really that it's this kind of complex interplay of individual level factors and community level factors that kind of come together to make people feel unsafe. There's two, I think, that are particularly relevant to the work that you might be doing in terms of implementing a public safety infrastructure project that I want to highlight. And this is from some really recent research that's quite useful. The first is this idea of collective efficacy as really a fancy word for the idea that people are willing to intervene to help one another, and there's a high level of trust within the community. The latest research shows us that communities where there's a low level of collective efficacy are more prone to being fearful. They're more prone to violent crime, but they're also more prone to being fearful. So actually, the sorts of projects that you might be implementing in public space that might have a kind of an agenda towards bringing people together, building community cohesion, might actually help to reduce fear of crime, but it's about understanding what it is that you're trying to do. But this is, some of the latest evidence is saying it's a really important driver. The other one I want to highlight is physical disorder. And this is not necessarily a new finding, but some of the latest research is showing how place-specific and time-specific fear of crime is and how that relates to disorder that exists within a community. It's this kind of idea of signal crimes, that particular crime problems or visible crime problems can actually impact how people perceive an area, even if that thing might be there briefly, graffiti for example, and then disappear. It really influences what people perceive a place to be like. And there's some really kind of neat examples of that, but it's obviously something you can target in terms of your public safety projects, but in terms of trying to reduce fear of crime. But again, I come back to being specific. It's really important to understand what you mean by fear of crime. Everyone talks about fear of crime, but actually if you look at the research and if you look at anybody's, and I've looked at a lot of grant applications in my time for crime prevention, people define it as very different things. You might be talking about worry about crime. You might be talking about the perceived risk of being a victim of crime, the impact of fear on quality of life, the way that people avoid a space or behave differently to try and reduce their risk of crime. It might be feelings of safety, it might be perceptions of risk, it might be kind of altruistic fear. I think this place is unsafe, I fear for other people using that space. You need to understand what it is that you're actually dealing with here and define it very specifically. Because these are different things, right? And they'll be influenced by different things. So someone's perceived risk of victimisation might be more likely to be influenced by the level of crime that occurs in an area, whereas the general worry about crime might not be. So it's important to understand what you're talking about when you mean fear or perceptions of safety. And some of the latest work that's coming out around fear of crime is quite helpful in understanding this. And it talks about the different dimensions of fear of crime. And it's quite interesting because what they do is, the likes of Emily Gray and Stephen Farrell, they distinguish between worry and anxiety. What they mean is there's that kind of generalised, anxiety about crime, which is kind of the, I'm anxious about crime generally. I feel unsafe generally and in public spaces. And it's typically what we tap into when we talk about community safety surveys. We're tapping into this kind of general anxiety about crime, about people's feelings of safety. It's really important to distinguish between that and worry about crime, and that's an event-specific thing. So people might have generalised anxiety, or they might feel completely fine, but they might worry in very particular areas or at very particular times. And the point is that when you run a community safety survey and you kind of embrace these ideas, what you typically show is that people feel a lot less unsafe than you think they might feel. When you actually ask about event-specific worry, people tend to say, oh, actually, I feel fine most of the time. It's just in that very particular place that I feel unsafe. So we typically, a lot of our surveys and a lot of our national surveys really overestimate the level of fear that exists in a community, and that's obviously quite problematic. The other idea is the difference between functional and dysfunctional fear. A little bit of fear is a good thing. You want people to be a little bit cautious about what they're doing in a particular location, because otherwise people they become apathetic. They start taking unnecessary risks. They start leaving their car unlocked. They start leaving possessions inside of in their car uncovered. Those sorts of things. You want people to be a little bit fearful because they become a little bit cautious. What you don't want is for that fear to become dysfunctional fear. It kind of reaches a tipping point where it actually starts to impact their lives negatively or make them feel uncomfortable. I'm not saying you want to make people a little bit fearful, so don't. I'm not saying go out and try and make people a little bit fearful. That's not a good thing. What I'm saying is you kind of want people to still remain somewhat cautious. Okay, and I mentioned some of the really recent research that's quite useful and particularly relevant to the sorts of projects we're talking about here and the sorts of environments we're talking about. This is an example from the UK where some researchers used some apps to measure people's perceptions of safety at different times of day and different locations. And we've seen examples of this in Australia in the past around mapping people's fear of crime, but not with using apps and actually sending them push notifications so they can actually say how you feel right now. And this is just an example of one particular person's response to that. It shows 20 time points on the left-hand side, and essentially you can see that their level of worry about fear really varied, right? It didn't stay static. So it's this idea that fear is time-specific and place-specific. So, and you can see in the map that there were particular areas right down the bottom for those who can't see it, where that person felt unsafe. Most of the time they felt fine. So it was actually about being place-specific. And this has actually just been recently, a bit too late for me to include it, but it's just been replicated up in Queensland. And the same phenomenon observed with kind of this measuring time-specific fear.